Robby, what's on your radar today?
Well, Brianna, so recently the mainstream media finally started paying some attention to the Twitter files. That's after completely ignoring for weeks the revelations that multiple arms of the federal government, the FBI, federal health officials, the White House, and on, pushed Twitter to censor the speech of everyday Americans on subjects like COVID, the 2020 election, Russia, and on and on and on. These revelations were brought to us by independent journalists Matt Taibbi, Bari Weiss, Michael Schellenberger, and others, and it was done with the cooperation of Twitter's new CEO, Elon Musk. Massive government collusion to silence Americans? That's a big story, isn't it? Well, not for the mainstream media for some reason. Now, that was until evidence emerged recently that Donald Trump had also pushed Twitter to censor content. Finally, this story had an angle that mainstream media can get behind. Orange man bad. Here's a refresher.
Earlier, you testified about a 2019 tweet that was about President Trump, and I think it was from Ms. Teigen. What was the tweet about?
Would you like me to give the direct quote?
Yeah.
Please excuse my language. This is a direct quote, but Chrissy Teigen referred to Donald Trump as a
Okay. Free speech. And what happened after Ms. Teigen posted her tweet? What did the White House do? What did the Trump White House do?
From my understanding, the White House reached out to ask that this tweet be removed. It was my team's job. This fell underneath the policy for abusive behaviors, and we evaluated underneath our insults policy. At that time, up to 3 insults were allowed, and so it was our job to determine how many insults were included within that phrase.
So the Trump White House reached out, not an agency, but the White House reached out and requested that you remove the tweet?
From my understanding, yes.
Okay.
Yes, according to reports, Trump pressed Twitter to do something about celebrity Chrissy Teigen, calling him a creative bad name. Unlike previous revelations that government forces were pressing Twitter to censor Americans, which did not merit so much as a mention from most national newspapers, magazines, and cable news shows, the Trump censorship story was covered exhaustively. BuzzFeed, Vanity Fair, The Cut, MSNBC, and so on. That was just some quick Googling I did this morning over breakfast. Now look, this deserves coverage because Donald Trump trying to get Twitter to censor criticism of him is absolutely wrong. It's worth calling out. But if it's wrong when Trump does it, isn't it wrong when other political figures do it too? That's the question Matt Taibbi is asking in his most recent Twitter files release. And in fact, he has discovered that Senator Angus King, an independent Democrat from Maine, contacted Twitter with a list of 354 sus accounts. What was so suspicious about these accounts? Well, one was excited about Rand Paul. Another was possibly a bot because it was averaging 20 tweets a day. Another was, quote, being followed by my rival Eric Brakey, a Republican political figure in Maine. Another account, quote, mentions immigration a lot. That's some fine detective work there, Senator. Taibbi also reminds his readers that Adam Schiff attempted to persuade Twitter to remove all content having to do with a member of his staff. Taibbi writes, quote, the fact that mainstream outlets ignored the Schiff story but howled about Teigen shows what they're about. Responses like this are designed to keep blue-leaning audiences especially focused on moronic partisan spats, obscuring bigger picture narratives. The real story emerging in the Twitter files is about a ballooning federal censorship bureaucracy that's not aimed at either the left or the right per se, but at the whole population of outsiders who are being systematically defined as threats. That's the problem, and you should care about it, even if it only has a little bit to do with Donald Trump.
So I think that's fair, but the thing that I've been pushing for throughout is that obviously the left liberal media wants to focus on Trump stories. So why is it that the Twitter files has gone out of its way not to do what Matt Taibbi did just there, which is to say this is a top-down issue. This is about insiders and powerful politicians and the government attacking the people. But instead, quite explicitly, and I believe the first Twitter files, I talked about this in my radar last week or the week before, in that first Twitter files thread, Matt Taibbi framed it as something that disproportionately is affecting the right. Now, my view and what I laid out in that radar was that I did not think at that time, and certainly now, there's enough evidence that has been disclosed to the public to really prove that case. And that's not necessarily Matt Taibbi or any of these journalists' fault. It's the nature of how these disclosures have been made so that we can't see what the whole body of discourse has been. So when something like the Chrissy Teigen exchange comes out, it really undermines the story that's been told up until this point, which is that this is all about the right attacking the left. Now, if Matt Taibbi reframes this is about people in power attacking average American citizens, including people like Chrissy Teigen, then frankly, I think that the Twitter files would have had more traction in mainstream even before this. And the Chrissy Teigen story wouldn't be used as a gotcha back to Matt Taibbi. It would be included as part of all of the useful reporting that they have been doing. And I think they really kind of shot themselves in the foot by coming out, I think, a little too prematurely aggressive with the framing that the Twitter files is about how there is a liberal attack on the right.
I don't think I agree that that was like a framing they chose or the way it comes. I think that people tried to slot it into that because it's not. And also, even if the framing is that the right has been targeted, I mean, what constitutes the right is an ever-evolving question. Like, most criticism of the Ukrainian effort, right, is now getting coded as right, even though it has very much in common with the left, and there are a lot of people who feel that way. The COVID dissent is right coded. All of that stuff, skepticism of Russiagate, again, right coded, even though there's nothing Republican or conservative about it necessarily. But more importantly, the aggressors, the censors and the silencers, I don't think that's getting it's Democrats because it's the FBI. What is the political party of the FBI? I mean, in some ways it's cable news, MSNBC, it's CNN.
That is true,
yeah.
And that is why I have been interested in and have never flinched in my articulation of the value of the Twitter files reporting. But this is from I believe it was the first Twitter files thread on December 2nd, Matt Taibbi. He says, the system wasn't balanced. It was based on contacts because Twitter was and is overwhelmingly staffed by people of one political orientation. There were more channels, more ways to complain open to the left, well, Democrats, than the right. This was not an accidental framing that happened separate and apart from Matt Taibbi. Now, Matt Taibbi also, of course, did say there was stuff coming from the Trump White House as well. And he re-articulated that when the Chrissy Teigen stuff came out. He said, well, I've always said there was stuff from Trump. But what some people pointed out, and I think it's fair, is that we didn't get the detail with respect to what Trump, the kind of censorship Trump was trying to wield on his behalf than we did other folks.
So Taibbi did say in this, or responding, I saw more tweets from himself, he said he's looked for some of the Trump stuff, like the Chrissy Teigen thing, and it's just not, it's not come out of the, he says he believes it. He said he has sources who have described these kinds of requests being made. He hasn't been able to find them. He believes they're being made, and that's what the situation is with respect to some of the Trump stuff.
So
that's
and
what
again,
he says.
I'm sorry, this is what I said on my radar last week. He also tweeted, this is around the time of all the Chrissy Teigen stuff coming out, that he said, I didn't see it, in response to someone who said, why didn't you report on this? He said, I didn't see it, I don't have it. However, I was, told by sources there had been requests from the Trump White House, which I reported even though I didn't have the actual text. And what that says to me is that Matt Taibbi knew that there was something about Trump making these requests and either didn't follow up to know more detail or tried to follow up and that information was withheld from him by Twitter. Either one of those things is a story. One, because it shows that Twitter is feeding him selective information. Alternatively, that he is claiming that he just couldn't find files when he is admitting here in this tweet that he knew of this information and reported the evidence of the information, but didn't actually get the information so that he could report on it as substantively as he has other kinds of documents. And that's a problem. That's going to be a problem for people. Because just flagging, hey, I heard there was some stuff about Trump, without going into the same detail you've told about the other stuff.
He looked for it. He just didn't find it. It didn't get produced.
He says, I didn't see it, I don't have it. I was, however, told by sources there had been requests from the Trump White House. So if you know there have been requests from the Trump White House, and you say, well, I just haven't seen anything from the Trump White House, to me, that is a journalistic gap where there is I'm not saying it's intentional, but there's a tacit misrepresentation of what evidence exists, even while you know that there is evidence that is not being unpacked in the public sphere.
He's just describing the situation. He said he was told that evidence exists. He tried to find it and could not obtain it.
Why not?
So he's just telling you it exists.
But that's the story, Robby. That is the story. The story is he cannot say this information didn't exist. It was more on the left when he knows there's a cache of documents out there, there's a cache of evidence out there that he either has not investigated and tried to get to or was not able to get to. Why? Why? That is a huge question. And if the answer is he could not access that information because Twitter, Elon Musk, whomever is in charge of these disclosures, did not want him to get it, arguably the implication is because that's a narrative that is not conducive to this is a liberal against the right framing that has been here from the beginning of the Twitter files, then that's a real problem. That's a real red flag. And I don't think it does a discredit, I think, to, again, the good and useful reporting that's coming out of the Twitter files.
I really don't think the framing is liberal versus the right. It's deep state, an apparatus that has harmed the left over and over again.
Do I have to read this tweet from December 2nd again, Robby? I mean, what do you make of this? What do you make of him saying, how can you argue that this isn't a narrative being promoted not just abstractly by people who are using the Twitter files, but by people who are reporting on the Twitter files as well? When in the very first thread, we have Taibbi saying the system wasn't balanced. It was based on contacts. Because Twitter was and is overwhelmingly staffed by people of one political orientation, there were more channels, more ways to complain open to the left, well, Democrats, than the right. And that's not the only moment in the Twitter files threads that he makes the case. He's
running these searches and they're not coming. He's not getting the documents that support as much of the.
But he had sources tell him there were documents that he was not able to access, and we now know at least what some of those documents said because the Chrissy Teigen stuff came out. So that's either, I'm sorry, negligent journalism, a lack of inquisitiveness, something that he should have followed up on, because he was aware. It wasn't like, oh, I had no idea, I looked and there was no reason to believe there was stuff that I wasn't getting. From the beginning, some of us have been saying, you don't know if you're getting the full picture. So making these kinds of claims is a little reckless. And now when we did get a bit bigger part of the picture, it's undermining his case in a way that, again, I don't want to happen. I think this is important reporting. But if you get caught flat-footed like this, there are people that are going to use it as a gotcha. And one last thing I'll say, when you're a lawyer and you know you have a fact that is unflattering to your case, you do not hide it. You have to disclose documents. You cannot bury it. What you do is you get the fact out first so that you can frame it in the way that you want to frame it before your opposing counsel gets to it. And Taibbi could have done that with some of these Trump claims, some of the, and presented a more balanced picture that bolstered his credibility. And I'm not saying he didn't hide this stuff. I'm not claiming that at all. But the fact that there wasn't more questions asked when he apparently knew, per his own tweet, that there were these Trump requests that didn't get reported on, and continued to argue that this was predominantly, that there was no evidence that the right was doing this in the way that the left was.
I would love to see him do that. I would also, I'll patiently wait for BuzzFeed to have an article about Adam Schiff and Angus King.
The criticism of BuzzFeed and all that is completely legitimate. They are flagrantly partisan in their coverage. That's obviously true. But I also do think that there is some responsibility here on the part of the Twitter files journalists to insulate themselves against those kind of claims by being more transparent than they have been, and also not leaning in so hard into the framing that they know the direction in which the bias is going so conclusively.
All right, well, we gotta leave it there. We'll have more Rising right after this. Stay tuned.